June 1942. Deep inside a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts are betting the survival of the entire Pacific Fleet on a single intercepted word in Japanese radio traffic: AF. By all conventional military metrics, the battered and desperately outnumbered United States Navy has absolutely no business engaging the undefeated Imperial Japanese fleet. Yet, based entirely on this fragmented intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz is preparing to send his only remaining aircraft carriers into a mathematically suicidal standoff. If the codebreakers are wrong about the true identity of the target, the ships will be annihilated, and the American West Coast will be left completely undefended. For decades, the ensuing Battle of Midway has been remembered as a flawless masterstroke of American military genius, a miraculous, almost preordained victory where an outnumbered force perfectly outmaneuvered a naval juggernaut. But the reality, preserved in declassified combat logs and the records of shattered flight squadrons, reveals a vastly different story. We will deconstruct this legendary engagement not as a clean tactical triumph, but as a chaotic collision of broken codes, fatal assumptions, and blind, terrifying luck. This is an investigation into a frantic, high-stakes intelligence war and the lethal scouting errors that blinded commanders on both sides of the Pacific. We will strip away the post-war mythology to examine the staggering cost paid in blood by the first desperate waves of American aviators, who flew into the teeth of the enemy completely exposed. The outcome was never guaranteed. It teetered constantly on a razor's edge of missed radio signals, mechanical malfunctions, and agonizing decisions made under unbearable pressure. How exactly did a desperate defensive gamble, one fundamentally plagued by catastrophic communication breakdowns and completely disjointed attacks, somehow culminate in a solitary, 5-minute window of violence that permanently broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy? In late May of 1942, the strategic reality of the Pacific dictated that the United States Navy was operating on borrowed time and sheer desperation. Across the vast expanse of the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed a crushing numerical and technological superiority. The tip of their spear was the Kido Butai, the elite First Air Fleet. This armada was built around heavily armored fleet carriers, seasoned aviators with combat experience spanning years in China and the early Pacific campaigns, and the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter aircraft that fundamentally outclassed anything the Americans could put in the sky. At the helm of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto envisioned a decisive knockout blow. His objective was not simply to capture the tiny atoll of Midway, a desolate spit of coral roughly 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was bait. Yamamoto's strategy, designated Operation MI, was a masterclass in grand, arguably overcomplicated naval maneuvering. He planned to divide his massive armada into multiple distinct flotillas, spread across thousands of miles of ocean. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to draw American attention north. Then, his 4 frontline carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would pound Midway into submission. Yamamoto assumed the American fleet, which he believed was demoralized and heavily depleted after the Battle of the Coral Sea, would sluggishly sortie from Pearl Harbor to defend the outpost, sailing directly into an intricately coordinated submarine and surface ship trap. It was a plan rooted in the assumption that the Americans were blind and predictable. But Yamamoto's strict adherence to radio silence, meant to conceal his sprawling fleet's movements, inadvertently blinded his own commanders, and, crucially, he was operating on fundamentally flawed intelligence regarding the condition of his enemy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was staring at a brutally unbalanced ledger. He had the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, but 2 flight decks were not enough to challenge 4 Japanese carriers. The USS Lexington lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The USS Yorktown was limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing a slick of oil, her hull severely damaged by a 500-pound bomb and near misses. Japanese naval intelligence assessed her as sunk. American naval engineers estimated she would require at least 3 months in dry dock to become combat effective again. Nimitz gave them 3 days. What transpired in dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor was an industrial miracle born of absolute necessity. As the Yorktown settled onto the blocks on May 28th, A rolling army of 1,400 ship fitters, welders, and electricians swarmed the vessel, working around the clock in suffocating heat. Amidst the stench of fuel and scorched metal, they bypassed standard protocols. They shored up the cracked bulkheads with massive wooden timbers and patched the flight deck in a frenzy of continuous welding. In exactly 72 hours, the Yorktown was refloated. As she steamed out of the harbor to join Task Force 16, civilian contractors were still below decks, welding patches and repairing electrical grids while the ship was underway. Nimitz now had 3 carriers. He was still outgunned, but he possessed the single most destructive weapon in the Pacific theater, the cryptanalysts of Station HYPO. Commander Joseph Rochefort's eccentric, sleep-deprived team had not just confirmed that Midway was the target. By piecing together fragments of the Japanese JN-25B naval code, they had essentially stolen Yamamoto's playbook. They mapped out the Japanese order of battle, the composition of their carrier striking force, and the exact date and angle of their approach. The Kido Butai would arrive from the northwest, launching their first airstrikes on June 4th. This intelligence transformed the entire strategic dynamic of the battle. Yamamoto was sailing into the mid-Pacific to execute an ambush. Nimitz, knowing the time and place, decided to ambush the ambushers. He dispatched his forces to a set of coordinates approximately 300 miles northeast of Midway, a position on the map designated simply as Point Luck. There, Task Forces 16 and 17 would wait in complete radio silence, positioning themselves on the flank of the Japanese approach vector. The objective was to let the Japanese strike Midway, locate the enemy carriers while their aircraft were engaged or refueling, and deliver a devastating counterpunch. Yet possessing intelligence on a map is vastly different from executing a coordinated strike on a featureless moving ocean. The Americans knew the enemy was coming, but they lacked a continuous picture of the battlefield. The Pacific was a canvas of localized weather fronts, low cloud ceilings, and shifting squalls. Both fleets were heavily dependent on the visual acuity of their scouting planes. The Japanese relied on float planes launched from cruisers, constrained by strict search patterns and plagued by mechanical delays. The Americans relied on a thin, overextended perimeter of slow, vulnerable PBY Catalina flying boats launched from Midway itself. Alongside their primitive, temperamental shipboard radar, the stage was set not for a cleanly orchestrated chess match, but for a high-stakes, blind duel in the open sea. By the evening of June 3rd, the vast armadas were maneuvering into their final positions, separated by hundreds of miles of dark water. The Americans held the ultimate trump card of foreknowledge, standing in the path of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most lethal formation. Yet they were fundamentally outmatched in aircraft performance, sheer tonnage, and combat experience. 3 patched-together carriers and their untried air groups were waiting in the silence of the Pacific, gambling the entire course of the war on finding an unseen enemy first. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the silence over the Pacific was shattered by the roar of Japanese radial engines. From the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched a massive strike force of 108 aircraft directly toward Midway Atoll. As the formations assembled in the dark, pre-dawn sky, Japanese commanders operated under a fatal assumption. They firmly believed the American carriers were still anchored safely in Hawaii. Nagumo's primary concern was systematically pulverizing the island's defenses to prepare for an amphibious invasion. He had no idea that Task Forces 16 and 17 were already lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to spring their trap. But the success of the American ambush relied entirely on finding the Kido Butai before the Japanese reconnaissance could find them. The burden of discovery fell on a thin perimeter of PBY Catalinas, slow and vulnerable flying boats that had been scanning the vast, empty ocean since before dawn. At 5:34 a.m., a Catalina piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80 slipped through a break in the heavy cloud cover and transmitted a frantic, unencrypted radio message. Enemy carriers. He had located the heavily defended core of the Japanese fleet. Aboard the USS Enterprise and Hornet, American commanders immediately recognized their fleeting window of opportunity. The ruthless tactical doctrine of carrier warfare in 1942 dictated one absolute rule: strike first, strike with everything, and catch the enemy flight decks while they are vulnerable. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance made the aggressive decision to launch a maximum effort strike. He committed his offensive capability, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts before the Japanese even realized a naval counterattack was possible. It was a desperate gamble to deliver a perfectly synchronized, overwhelming hammer blow. However, the ambition of a coordinated ambush instantly collided with the severe technological limitations of the era. The United States Navy lacked the sophisticated air search radar and reliable ship-to-air radio networks necessary to orchestrate a massive multi-carrier strike in mid-air. As the American squadrons launched and climbed into the morning sky, the elaborate tactical plan began to rapidly disintegrate. Different aircraft types climbed at completely different speeds. The heavily laden Devastator torpedo bombers wallowed at low altitudes. The Dauntless dive bombers pushed high into the freezing air, and the Wildcat fighters struggled to maintain visual contact through the towering cumulus clouds. Without a central airborne coordinator or disciplined radio communication, the squadrons failed to form up. The concept of a unified attack evaporated. Instead, the American offensive shattered into a chaotic, disjointed scatter of isolated groups. The carefully laid trap had devolved into a piecemeal assault, leading dozens of American planes burning precious fuel, navigating blindly by dead reckoning over a featureless ocean, disconnected and dangerously vulnerable. While the American strike force fractured into disorganized, isolated fragments in the high-altitude freezing clouds, the fate of the Japanese Empire was quietly and irreversibly being sealed by a localized mechanical failure on the steel deck of a heavy cruiser. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's entire operational security rested on a rigid, highly regimented morning search pattern. The Japanese commanders firmly believed they held the element of surprise, but to ensure the mighty Kido Butai was not caught off guard by any unforeseen naval threats, a thin perimeter of single-engine floatplanes had been catapulted from the escorting cruisers at first light. These reconnaissance aircraft fanned out across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in precise, mathematically determined wedge-shaped search sectors. It was a theoretically sound naval doctrine, but in practice, it was dangerously fragile and spread too thin. The Japanese relied heavily on single aircraft to cover thousands of square miles of empty ocean, meaning any disruption in the strict timetable would leave massive, unmonitored blind spots in the fleet's defensive screen. On the heavy cruiser Tone, operating on the outer edge of the carrier formation, that exact disruption occurred. At 4:30 a.m., the Aichi E-13A float plane, designated as Tone No. 4, was scheduled to launch and fly a 300-mile outbound leg directly to the east-northeast, but the ship's heavy steam catapult suffered a critical pressure malfunction. Mechanics swarmed the catapult track, frantically working in the dark to resolve the mechanical issue, while the rest of the fleet steamed forward into enemy waters. In the unforgiving arithmetic of naval reconnaissance, time is indistinguishable from distance. For a full half hour, Tone No. 4 sat paralyzed on the steel rails, its engine idling uselessly. When the catapult finally fired and the float plane clawed its way into the dawn sky, it was 30 minutes behind schedule. That specific half-hour delay geometrically distorted the entire Japanese search net, creating a fatal, moving shadow over the exact quadrant of the Pacific where Admiral Spruance's task forces were currently steaming. Completely unaware of the precise, catastrophic danger growing in that unsearched sector, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the enclosed flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, enveloped in an atmosphere of absolute, almost supreme confidence. It was shortly after 7 a.m. The first wave of Japanese dive bombers and Zero fighters was currently returning from their highly destructive raid on the Midway atoll. The radio on the flag bridge crackled with a message from the strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. His assessment of the American island fortress was blunt and professional. There is need for a second attack. Nagumo faced a critical command decision, but in his mind, it was purely a logistical one, not a matter of immediate fleet survival. Below him, sealed deep inside the cavernous hangar decks of his 4 fleet carriers, sat his elite reserve force. Half of his aircraft were fully fueled and armed with heavy Type 91 aerial torpedoes, strictly preserved and waiting for any sign of the American Navy. But the early morning scouting reports had universally returned nothing but empty water. The American carriers were theoretically thousands of miles away, anchored safely at Pearl Harbor, or operating far to the south. Operating on this deeply flawed, culturally reinforced assumption of Japanese initiative, Nagumo decided to prioritize the immediate destruction of Midway's remaining air defenses. He could not risk American land-based bombers threatening his carriers. At 7:15 a.m., he issued a fateful command: stand down the anti-ship reserve, strike the heavy torpedoes into the magazines, and rearm the Nakajima Kate bombers with high-explosive land bombs for a second decisive run on the island. The execution of this order initiated a grueling, meticulously orchestrated industrial ballet below decks. In 1942, changing the ordnance on an entire strike wing of aircraft was an agonizingly slow, intensely physical process. Hundreds of Japanese armorers wrestled with heavy hydraulic carts in the cramped confines of the hangars, carefully unbolting the long cylindrical torpedoes from the bellies of the aircraft, lowering them to the wooden decks, and hoisting massive 800-pound land bombs into place. The hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu hummed with the synchronized labor of a navy at the absolute peak of its operational efficiency, confidently preparing to deliver a final knockout blow to the American outpost. Then, at 7:28 a.m., the delayed scout plane, Tone Number 4, finally reached the edge of its assigned search radius and broke radio silence. The message filtering into the Akagi's radio room was brief, vague, and utterly terrifying. The pilot reported sighting 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 10 degrees, 240 miles from Midway. The supreme confidence on the Japanese flag bridge instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing anxiety. Nagumo was caught completely off guard. 10 ships. Were they merely cruisers and destroyers, or were there aircraft carriers hidden in that formation? The scout pilot did not specify, nor did he mention flight decks. If there was even a single American carrier in that formation, Nagumo's entire fleet was in imminent existential danger. He desperately radioed the scout plane, demanding immediate clarification on the ship types, but the float plane was dodging American anti-aircraft fire and struggling with a faulty radio transmitter. The silence from the scout dragged on for agonizing, irreplaceable minutes. Caught halfway through rearming his reserve force for a land strike, Nagumo vacillated, trapped in a strategic nightmare. He needed to launch his reserve against the ships, but they were currently armed with bombs meant for concrete bunkers, not armored hulls. At 7:45 a.m., he issued a frantic counter-order: halt the loading of the land bombs and immediately switch back to the anti-ship torpedoes. The highly disciplined atmosphere on the Japanese hangar decks instantly devolved into frantic, chaotic desperation. Sweating armorers were forced to unbolt the massive land bombs they had just spent 30 minutes painstakingly attaching, but the elevators connecting the hangars to the deep, heavily armored magazines were far too slow to keep up with the frenetic pace of the changing orders. Under the crushing pressure of time, the armorers made a fatal, unavoidable compromise. Instead of returning the explosive ordnance to the safety of the lower magazines, they simply rolled the massive land bombs against the hangar bulkheads, leaving them completely exposed. Simultaneously, thick aviation fuel lines were snaking across the decks to top off the returning fighters. The rigid, flawless doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was collapsing under the weight of conflicting intelligence and impossible timelines. In a matter of minutes, the 4 most powerful warships on the planet had been transformed into highly combustible floating warehouses, heavily littered with unsecured high explosives and pulsing with highly volatile aviation gas. While Nagumo desperately tried to rearm his lethal striking arm and process the returning Midway strike, the horizon betrayed the first sign that time had officially run out. Without sophisticated air search radar, the Japanese relied entirely on high-powered binoculars and the incredibly sharp eyes of lookouts posted high in the pagoda masts. Shortly before 9:30 a.m., those lookouts spotted dark specks skimming terrifyingly low over the whitecaps. The uncoordinated, disjointed American strike had finally stumbled upon the Kido Butai. These were not the high-altitude dive bombers Nagumo feared. It was Torpedo Squadron 8, operating from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Through a combination of dead reckoning and sheer, stubborn intuition, Waldron had separated from the rest of the disorganized American air group, correctly anticipating the Japanese fleet's evasive movement to the north. But this navigational success carried a lethal, inescapable penalty. Waldron had completely lost contact with his protective fighter escort in the heavy clouds. His 15 Douglas TBD Devastators were flying into the heart of the Japanese fleet, entirely alone. The Devastator was a glaring symbol of American technological obsolescence, a slow, lumbering, woefully underpowered aircraft that had to drop to a mere 100 feet above the waves and fly in a painfully slow, straight line to properly drop its torpedo. As the American squadron crept toward the Japanese carriers at just over 100 miles per hour, Nagumo's logistical panic instantly shifted to aggressive tactical defense. The Japanese carriers leaned hard into violent evasive maneuvers, carving massive, churning white wakes into the deep blue ocean, turning their narrow sterns toward the approaching threat to present the smallest possible target profile. Simultaneously, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of Mitsubishi Zero fighters that had been circling high above the fleet, spotted the low-flying American intruders. The Zeros rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean's surface like predatory hawks. What followed was not a battle. It was a systematic, clinical execution. The Zero was arguably the most agile fighter aircraft in the world, armed with twin 20mm cannons that tore through the thin aluminum skin of the American bombers with devastating ease. The unescorted Devastators were little more than sitting ducks. The veteran Japanese pilots swooped in from the rear, easily matching the sluggish pace of the American planes, and unleashed streams of tracer fire into their cockpits, engines, and fuel tanks. One by one, the American torpedo bombers erupted into blossoms of orange flame and thick black smoke, slamming into the Pacific at high speed and cartwheeling across the surface. The radio channels were filled with the desperate, final calls of American pilots and rear gunners fighting an utterly hopeless rearguard action against an overwhelmingly superior machine. They held their agonizingly straight torpedo runs, refusing to break formation, flying directly into a terrifying wall of anti-aircraft fire tearing up the water in front of them. The slaughter was absolute. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were mercilessly shot out of the sky before they could inflict any damage. Out of 30 men in the squadron, only one, Ensign George Gay, survived the massacre, clinging to a floating seat cushion in the middle of the Japanese fleet, helplessly watching the destruction of his unit. The horror of the torpedo attacks did not end with Waldron's men. Subsequent waves of torpedo bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown arrived shortly after, and they too were fed directly into the same merciless meat grinder. They attacked in isolated, completely unsupported waves, lacking the speed to escape and the fighters to defend themselves. The Japanese Zeros danced through their broken formations, shredding the American squadrons with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Torpedo Squadron 6 was decimated. Torpedo Squadron 3 was practically annihilated, and compounding the tragedy, the American Mark 13 torpedoes proved to be fundamentally defective. Not a single American torpedo found its mark. Every piece of ordnance dropped either missed wildly, ran too deep beneath the ships, or simply failed to detonate against the Japanese hulls with a dull thud. From the enclosed bridges of the Akagi and the Kaga, the Japanese commanders watched this horrific display of slaughter unfold with a mixture of grim respect and absolute, supreme validation. They recognized the sheer suicidal bravery of the American aviators who stubbornly flew their obsolete machines into certain death without hesitation. But strategically, the massacre confirmed everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about themselves. Their combat air patrol was an impenetrable shield. Their evasive ship maneuvering was flawless. Their Zero fighters were completely untouchable. As the last burning remnants of the American torpedo squadrons slipped beneath the waves, leaving nothing but oil slicks and debris, the Japanese flag bridge exhaled a collective breath of relief. They had absorbed the absolute best the United States Navy could throw at them, and they had not suffered a single scratch. To Admiral Nagumo and his veteran staff, the horrific sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons appeared to be the final, desperate gasp of a defeated enemy, permanently cementing their own technological and tactical invulnerability. But this profound sense of invulnerability masked a catastrophic tactical reality. By repelling the desperate American assaults so flawlessly, the Imperial Japanese Navy had inadvertently engineered its own destruction. The uncoordinated, piecemeal nature of the American torpedo attacks, arriving in isolated waves over the course of an hour, had forced the Japanese combat air patrol into a state of continuous, frantic reaction. To intercept the lumbering devastators skimming just 100 feet over the Pacific, dozens of veteran Zero pilots had been forced to surrender their most critical tactical advantage, altitude. They had plunged from their high-altitude patrol stations down to the very deck of the ocean. Down on the Whitecaps, the Japanese fighters became entirely consumed by the slaughter. They scattered across miles of ocean, chasing the doomed American squadrons, breaking their disciplined defensive formations in the frenzy of the kill. This relentless, hour-long engagement carried a severe logistical cost. The Zeros were burning through their aviation fuel reserves at an alarming rate while executing violent, low-level maneuvers. More importantly, they were rapidly exhausting their limited supply of 20mm cannon ammunition to shred the American bombers. As the last torpedo plane went down, the Japanese fighter screen was completely out of position, disorganized, running low on ammunition, and trapped at sea level. It was a paradox of early carrier warfare. The flawless execution of a tactical defense inherently created the ultimate strategic vulnerability. The relentless focus on the threat skimming the waves blinded the fleet to the sky above them. Without a single admiral on the flag bridge or a single pilot in a cockpit realizing it, the horrific sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons had manipulated the entire Japanese defensive grid. The failed, suicidal assaults had effectively dragged the invincible Japanese shield down to the water, pulling the Zeros away from the clouds and leaving the airspace directly over the 4 fleet carriers completely unprotected. A temporary invisible void had just opened directly above the Kido Butai, and perfectly suspended in the freezing air miles above that void, the high-altitude trap was about to spring shut. High above that invisible void, the trap was dangerously close to failing completely. The American dive bomber squadrons from the USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, were flying on fumes. For nearly an hour, they had been burning precious aviation gas, searching an empty ocean, arriving at the intercepted coordinates only to find nothing but rolling blue waves. The Japanese fleet had altered course, and the American strike was hopelessly lost. McCluskey was operating past the point of no return. His fuel gauges were dropping toward empty, and standard doctrine dictated an immediate retreat to save his pilots. Instead, he made the calculated decision to push his squadron further, initiating a desperate, expanding search pattern. At that exact moment, pure, unpredictable chance intercepted history. Glancing through the broken clouds, McCluskey spotted a solitary white streak scarring the vast surface of the Pacific. It was a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. She had been left behind by the main fleet to drop depth charges on a prowling American submarine, the USS Nautilus, and was now rushing at maximum speed to rejoin the carrier formation. She was not transmitting on the radio, nor was she firing weapons. She was simply leaving a massive, unmistakable arrow of churning white water pointing directly toward the Imperial Japanese Navy. McCluskey banked his squadrons and followed the wake. At exactly 10:22 a.m., the clouds parted, and the Americans looked down upon the ultimate prize. Below them sat the pride of the Japanese Empire, steaming forward in a relaxed cruising formation. Crucially, there were no Zero fighters in the sky above them to intercept. Their flight decks were heavily packed with the explosive remnants of the aborted rearming process. Dozens of unsecured torpedoes, high explosive land bombs, and pressurized aviation fuel lines littered the hangar decks, resting exactly where the frantic armorers had abandoned them. The American SBD Dauntless dive bombers pitched over, entering steep 70-degree dives. They plummeted out of the freezing air directly into the completely undefended airspace created by the slaughtered torpedo squadrons. The mechanical howl of their dive brakes pierced the sky before the Japanese lookouts could even scream a warning. It was a perfectly timed intersection of sheer American luck and maximum self-inflicted Japanese vulnerability. Heavy armor-piercing bombs smashed through the wooden flight decks of the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. The initial impacts were devastating, but it was what lay waiting just below the decks that sealed their fate. The American ordnance detonated deep inside the enclosed hangar decks, instantly igniting the exposed torpedoes, the stacked bombs, and the highly volatile aviation gas. The resulting chain reaction of internal secondary explosions physically tore the massive warships apart from the inside out. In a span of just 5 terrifying minutes, 3 Imperial aircraft carriers were transformed into uncontrollable burning steel coffins. In exactly 300 seconds, the balance of power in the Pacific Ocean was violently and permanently rewritten in fire. While the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned on the open swells, a 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, survived just long enough to launch a counterstroke that mortally wounded the patched-together USS Yorktown. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers tracked the lone survivor down, burying heavy ordnance into her flight deck and sealing the fate of the entire 1st Air Fleet. In a single day of combat, 4 frontline carriers, the absolute spearhead of the Imperial naval machine, were wiped from the Pacific ledger. The desperate intelligence gamble taken weeks earlier inside that windowless Pearl Harbor basement had paid off, but not through a flawless tactical masterstroke. The codebreakers of Station HYPO had correctly identified Target AF, giving Admiral Nimitz the exact coordinates of the ambush. Yet foreknowledge alone did not guarantee destruction. The annihilation of the Kido Butai was ultimately secured by an impossibly fragile chain of circumstance: a 30-minute steam catapult delay on an escorting cruiser, the horrific sacrifice of unescorted torpedo squadrons that pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to the waves, and a lost commander glimpsing the solitary wake of a rushing destroyer through a break in the clouds. For decades, post-war mythology has suggested that the Battle of Midway instantly decided the war in the Pacific. It did not. Japan's shipyards continued to produce vessels, and grueling, bloody campaigns across contested island chains dragged on for 3 more years. What Midway permanently shattered was not simply 4 steel hulls, but an irreplaceable human core. In the inferno of those exploding hangar decks, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost hundreds of elite pre-war aviators and master mechanics, veterans with thousands of hours of specialized training and combat experience. An empire with limited training infrastructure could eventually construct new aircraft carriers, but it could never manufacture another generation of elite airmen to fly from their decks. Ultimately, the turning point of the Pacific War was never dictated by overwhelming American industrial might or a flawlessly executed strategic script. The victory was forged entirely in the chaotic, unforgiving margins of human error and mechanical chance. A desperate, highly flawed defensive gamble succeeded because of a single intercepted radio fragment, a faulty steam valve on an escorting cruiser, and the blind luck of a lost pilot looking down at the right moment. The myth of an invincible maritime empire was dismantled not by a superior armada, but by a cracked code, a broken catapult, and 5 minutes of fatal timing.